All right, we are back. Hope everybody enjoyed the first physical class session. Glad those of you could make it out tonight, or at least proverbially in this hybrid format for this follow-up session. I wanted to start by going over a little bit of what we had reviewed last class. So we started off more or less defining the notion of welfare in terms of this concept of total surplus. And the idea behind total surplus was we were adding up the piece of economic pie for each individual agent in the market. In the simplest case of a buyer and a seller, we added the buyer's piece, the consumer surplus, to the seller's piece, producer surplus. And that gave us the ability to evaluate the efficiency and equity of a market outcome in terms of thinking about this proverbial economic pie. And we started out pretty basic with this case of looking at a single unit traded between a buyer and a seller in the context of a used car sale. We thought about the conditions under which the trade could make everybody better off. We said it didn't necessarily have to. For example, if you force two people to trade who shouldn't, whose values aren't aligned, then it's possible we have actually a surplus reducing trade, which we saw in the context of a subsidy last class. The conditions under which trade could make everybody better off was if that trade was mutually beneficial and everybody voluntarily had something to gain from the trade, and hence, as a rational consumer or producer, wanted to go through with it. We also spent a good amount of time kind of highlighting this dual definition of a demand and a supply curve. The base definition of a demand curve, probably as you're going through the textbook, was that given some price, the demand curve kind of spit out for us the quantity that somebody would be willing to buy. Similarly, the definition of a supply curve was given some price, the supply curve was spitting out a quantity that somebody would want to supply and sell in the market. However, we could think of both of those concepts kind of on their heads, in that the alternative definition of a demand curve, we could think along the vertical price axis as measuring the value that a consumer was willing to pay at max for a particular unit, which reflected their dollar value marginal benefit of consumption. Similarly, the supply curve, we argued, you could think of as measuring the seller's minimum willingness to accept payment for a good or service, which reflects that seller's marginal cost of producing that goods, and which is a type of variable production cost, the marginal cost of producing just one more unit. We spent a little bit of time reviewing this concept of market equilibrium, which is the allocation at which the quantities supplied and demanded at the given price are both the same, implying that there's no presence of surplus or shortage. And we also discussed the efficiency properties of the market equilibrium in the context of Adam Smith's invisible hand, in that the market equilibrium allocation tended to maximize the size of the total surplus, or the size of what we're calling the economic pie. And again, the main application of going through all this surplus and efficiency analysis is to come back and be able to do some policy analysis and policy prescription. And we did a first tiny look at that by analyzing the distributional and efficiency effects of a binding price ceiling, which was a maximum cap on the legal price of a good in a trade. So this was considering a little bit of command and control type government intervention in determining the price of that market allocation. We concluded class by taking a few questions regarding the elasticity of demand and its relationship to total sales revenue. And I wanted to highlight a little bit about that. And more or less, I'm going to go through these bullet points fairly quickly until we get to elasticity. I've realized one thing we didn't really discuss were determinants of elasticity. Why does a market exhibit less price sensitivity with respect to buyers than a different market? And we will come back to that momentarily. Absolutely going to be a lot of follow-up slides on some of this material. coming up this week, so please do keep an eye out on the Blackboard page for new videos being posted. So let's just get to it. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Consumer surplus was measuring the value to the buyer less the amount the buyer had to pay, which is the total revenue extracted from the buyer, the amount that the buyer pays. And we could think about the value minus the revenue paid as the buyer's gain from participating in this transaction. Similarly, the seller's surplus or the producer surplus was the amount the sellers received less the cost of the sellers producing that particular unit. So again, this was the metric that was summarizing the seller's gain from participating in the market. And the nice thing is these are both dollar value metrics of well-being, dollar value metrics of welfare. In order to measure the total surplus, the total size of the economic pie, all we have to do is add up the consumer's piece and the producer's piece. And this now measures the total gains resulting from trade in a particular market. Now, if you look very carefully, you'll notice the amount paid by buyers and the amount received by sellers. That is the same thing. These two expressions here, those are both the same expression, amount paid by buyers and amount received by sellers. That's just the revenue transferred in the trade. So when I add those two quantities together, you'll notice the revenue goes away and we're just left with total surplus reflecting the value to the buyer, that marginal benefit to buyers, minus that marginal cost, that variable cost to the sellers. And that the actual amount paid, that canceled out. That didn't determine the size of the pie. And we actually saw that in class when we considered changing the price a little bit. We said, hey, suppose the seller was a little bit better negotiator, seller got a little bit higher price out of the buyer. And we noted that as long as the trade still happened, the surplus pie did not change size, meaning the efficiency of the market was still maximal. Okay, so in terms of measuring efficiency, our criteria here is absolutely going to be total surplus for the near future. And the total surplus of a trade revalues the difference between the value to the buyers in that society minus the cost to sellers of producing that good, the variable production cost to sellers of producing that good. And we are now thinking about an allocation of resources yielding an efficient outcome if that allocation is able to maximize the size of total surplus, meaning we're getting the biggest economic pie in total that we can. So just keep in mind, efficiency implies here that goods are consumed by the buyers who value them the most highly. And at the same time, the goods are being produced by producers that can produce these goods at the lowest possible cost. Okay, and at this point, if we were to try to reallocate resources, raising or lowering the quantity of a good traded would not increase the total surplus if we are, in fact, at the efficient allocation. So we started looking at this property of the market equilibrium, which was the price and quantity at which the quantity supplied and demanded were both equal to each other, implying there was no shortage or surplus. And in this particular diagram, hopefully it's fairly obvious that the market equilibrium is described by a price of 30 bucks and a quantity of 15, in this case 15,000 units being traded in this market. Note that the consumer surplus triangle we were able to identify as the area above the price, below the demand curve, and to the left of the quantity traded. Similarly, the producer surplus triangle we could identify by looking at the area below the equilibrium price, above the supply curve, to the left of the quantity traded. Okay, and one of the questions we started thinking about last class and we answered was, to what extent is the market equilibrium efficient? Or is it efficient? And the answer that we saw last class was that in terms of thinking about total surplus and maximizing the economic pie, the answer was yes, that the outcome here actually was efficient. And this diagram here corresponds to the largest the economic pie can actually be in this particular market situation. So the reason why it's efficient, let's think about this in a little bit more detail here. Okay, if you think from the buyer's perspective, okay, who is actually buying the goods? So imagine You have all these different buyers lined up along the demand curve. Okay, towards the top of the demand curve, you have the highest willingness to pay buyer. And then as we go down the demand curve, the buyers that have lower willingness to pay start showing up. Okay, and if we think in this context, okay, which buyers actually buy the good? Well, a buyer only goes through with the transaction if the total surplus that the buyer receives, that consumer surplus on that unit, is positive, meaning the buyer's willingness to pay is greater than the price. So notice all the buyers that wind up buying the good are the buyers whose maximum willingness to pay is larger than that equilibrium price of 30 bucks. So this region here, the top part of that demand curve, these are all buyers that do go ahead and purchase the good. The bottom portion of the demand curve are buyers whose willingness to pay did not justify buying the good. Okay, so the implication here is that in this market equilibrium, the buyers who actually wind up buying the good are in fact the ones with the highest values. Okay, they're the ones higher up on the demand curve, meaning in the market allocation, we are giving the good, we're rationing it to the people who exhibit the highest marginal benefit for. Now on the seller side of the market, we see something very similar. Which sellers produce the good? Well, at a price of 30, a seller is only going to produce the good if that seller receives positive producer surplus, meaning they would have to be able to sell the good at a price above their marginal cost. Okay, so a seller's only going to go ahead and sell at a price of 30 if his marginal cost is below that. So all these sellers down here on the lower part of the supply curve, all of them have a marginal production cost, a willingness to accept less than $30. So they are all willing to go ahead and supply this good because they will make a positive amount of producer surplus. On the other hand, any sellers that have a marginal cost above 30, they choose not to produce the good and hence will stay out of this market. Okay, because producing the good requires them to engage at a cost higher than the $30 revenue per unit they will receive. Okay, so the point being here is that the sellers with the lowest cost are the ones that wind up doing production. Okay, meaning that the allocation is efficient in that the buyers who participate are the ones with the highest values, and the sellers who participate are the ones with the lowest possible cost. What I want to do next is just review the two sources of deadweight loss, of shrinkage in the total surplus pie. The first source of deadweight loss that we discussed was the deadweight loss resulting from too few trades. So this tends to happen when a trade winds up being blocked that otherwise would have been mutually beneficial and would have generated total surplus. For example, if we were to stop trading at a quantity of 10 units in this market, okay, notice that the seller's marginal cost of that 10th unit is 25 bucks. Okay, and we can find a buyer who's willing to pay 40. Now, if those two individuals do not trade, okay, then we miss out on being able to generate the $15 of surplus, okay, by giving a unit where the buyer values it at 40 and it only costs the seller 25. Similarly, we miss out on really all the units that we could have been producing between 10 and 15 where the value to the buyers exceeded the cost to the sellers. All right, and this is true really at any quantity less than 15 units. If we're to the left of that equilibrium quantity, we are missing out on a mutually beneficial opportunity to engage in trade and to generate more economic pie. And the area of that triangle there represents the size of the deadweight loss, the size of the pie shrinkage. The other source of deadweight loss that we could come across in a market is a situation where there is too much trade facilitated in this market. For example, at a quantity of 20 units, the seller that is willing to sell that unit faces a marginal cost of $35. If we were to force this seller to trade with the buyer of that unit, who is only willing to pay $20, then the result would be a net loss of $15, meaning we generated a piece of surplus that is actually negative. meaning when we add it back to the rest of the economic pie generated from all the other units being traded, this type of trade causes total surplus to go down. Note that this is true at any quantity larger than 15 in this diagram, such that the cost to the seller exceeds the value to the buyers in society, implying that producing and trading any of those units would do so at a net loss to society, represented by a reduction in total surplus. And we can measure that again, the reduction in total surplus from overproducing, by measuring the area that represents the value of all of these excess trades, by which the cost to the seller exceeds the value to the buyer. Okay, so the question of whether or not the equilibrium quantity in the market maximizes total surplus, I think, is fairly clear at this point, in that it does. And this is the famous result that Adam Smith had so popularized in 1776 in his book Wealth of Nations, that if you essentially apply a laissez-faire policy, kind of a hands-off policy in this competitive market framework, then these market forces of selfish sellers and buyers trying to do the best for themselves, which pushes the market price towards equilibrium, alleviating shortages of surpluses, does in fact drive the market to an allocation that maximizes the net benefit to society in terms of the total economic benefits as measured by total surplus. Now, we took some time at the end of last class looking at how potential government intervention can alter this result. And just an example of a couple government policies that we're going to consider. And we're going to look at some price controls. We took a look at an example of a price ceiling last class, and we discussed rent control as an example of a price ceiling. Other historical examples of price ceilings, one that's brought up frequently, are the gas price ceilings under the Nixon administration that drove up gas prices in the 70s, that were meant to combat high gas prices in the 70s, but the unintended consequence of this were extremely long lines at the gas station and an overall shortage of supply. We're going to take a look at an example of a price floor right now to kind of compare your results from the in-class session on price ceiling to the resulting allocation under a price floor. And taxes and subsidies are also other methods of price manipulation in terms of thinking about government intervention. Okay, in the case of a tax, the government can force a buyer or a seller to pay a specific amount on each unit. And for this course, we're going to think of a subsidy as literally a negative tax. So in a negative tax situation, subsidy, the government is literally giving money to buyers and sellers that is financed out of the pool of tax funds. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use our supply and demand framework to analyze the efficiency and distributional effects of the market outcome in the cases of these binding price controls. We're going to do this by using sort of a benchmark comparison, first considering always what is the size of the economic pie when we don't have the regulation in play, and then how does the size of the economic pie as well as the cutting of it change once the regulation is in play. And the example we thought about in class yesterday was the case of a price ceiling. And we discussed this in the context really of thinking about rent control. So if you imagine P is the rental price of apartments in a particular market, Q is the quantity of apartments. We have some demand for these apartments that follows the law of demand. We have a supply curve for these apartments as well. And the equilibrium without price controls, let's suppose here monthly rent is $800. And at that monthly rent, we wind up selling exactly 300 units, which are both supplied and demanded. What we want to think about is how implementing a price ceiling could potentially alter this outcome if we were to, say, place some restriction on the maximum selling price of the good. Okay? And you'll notice in this particular case, I've put that maximum selling price, that cap, up at $1,000. However, at a price above equilibrium, the market is still able to reach equilibrium, implying that the price ceiling at any value above $800 is non-binding in that it does not restrict those market forces that we discussed in class from pushing the price down to 800. What that price ceiling does prevent, it's a legal mandate that prevents any transaction taking place at a price or a term higher than 1,000, but 800 is certainly lower, meaning that this price ceiling set at $1,000 does not restrict the market from reaching equilibrium and hence does not result in an inefficient allocation of resources. The only situation where that price ceiling would be causing problems is if instead we were to impose it below $800, below that equilibrium price, implying that this price ceiling is now a binding legal constraint. Okay, so now the price cannot go above 500. If the price was below 500, okay, then we know there's a shortage caused and buyers would try to bid the price up. Problem now is the government has put a mandate on what the highest legal price that the buyers are allowed to bid up to entails without going into black market transactions, implying that that $500 price ceiling imposes a shortage. Okay, we have 400 units that buyers want to purchase, but sellers aren't thrilled that the price is being held artificially low by this regulation. Sellers are responding by reducing their output, and they're only willing to sell 250 units, implying a shortage of exactly 150 units. The reason why shortages tend to lead to an inefficient allocation of resources, well, first and foremost, we noticed that the quantity of trade here is going to be 250, which is down from the 300 equilibrium. So the price ceiling has absolutely blocked some mutually beneficial trades, which we identified in class. But the other reason that the shortages tend to lead to inefficient outcomes from more of an intuitive and less of a graphical perspective is that the rationing mechanism under the shortages could be very inefficient. For example, in situations where the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, often what you see are long lines, okay, implying that the rationing mechanism may take the form of first come, first serve, rather than the person with the highest value gets the good. Now, keep in mind, in the market equilibrium, the buyers with the highest values are the ones receiving the goods. Okay? Under a shortage, there is no guarantee that that's the case if we make the buyer say, get in line, unless they happen to line up where the buyer with the highest value is in the front of the line. Other things that could happen is the seller might recognize they have some market power in this case and decide to give the good to their friend, who maybe isn't the one with the highest value, but is one that conforms to the seller's biases. In these situations, the mechanisms are often unfair, inequitable, and inefficient. The goods do not necessarily get allocated to the buyers who value them the most highly. Okay? Conversely, when prices are not controlled, the rationing mechanism in the market equilibrium was efficient. The buyers who were willing to value the goods the most are the ones who bought them, and the sellers who could produce them at the lowest cost were the ones who produced them. Okay, now, I would like to go through a full example of a price floor and actually measuring the economic pie before and after the transaction, before and after we impose a price restraint. And the price restraint we're going to think about today is effective in the market for unskilled labor, and that price restraint we're going to consider is a price floor on the wage. Okay, this is kind of an infamous example. The minimum wage is a very highly referenced example of how government intervention in the form of a price restriction can often cause unintended consequences. So on the vertical axis, we're still measuring price. We just changed it to W here to think about the wage paid to workers. Similarly, we're measuring quantity on the horizontal axis. In this case here again, thinking about the total quantity of workers. Okay, firms hiring workers in this case generate the demand in this market, and the workers themselves facing a trade-off between how much leisure to enjoy and how much income to earn generate the supply of labor in this market. Let's assume here, without any price controls, that the market equilibrium is described by a wage of $6 per hour and a total number of 500 hours of labor hired. And what we're going to do next is impose our price restraint. Again, if we set a price floor, a minimum restriction, below equilibrium, then the price floor is not binding. It is not preventing us from reaching that market equilibrium through buyers of labor bidding up the price of labor. So similar to the price ceiling example, the price floor is only going to be causing problems in terms of efficiency if it is set in a region where it is binding. And a binding price floor requires us to set that price floor above the equilibrium price of $6. So in this example, a binding price floor at $7.25 does in fact reduce the quantity of workers that the firms would like to hire. So in this case, the firms only want to hire 400 workers. They're not thrilled about that price being held artificially high. But who is thrilled? Well, the workers are happy. At an artificially higher wage, they're willing to work more hours than they would have. Problem is, there's only 400 hours of job available, but the workers would like to supply 550. So in this case, we have some resources that are going unemployed. And when you think about unemployment, and we'll talk about this again when we get to our macroeconomics unit, but unemployment is literally described in this diagram that we're looking at, a labor surplus. What is that? Well, that's more workers willing to work than there are jobs available. This is unemployment. So under this binding constraint, the minimum wage, provided again that it's binding, does cause some unemployment here. It's causing a labor surplus in this market. One thing to keep in mind here is that we're dealing specifically with the market for low-wage workers. If you're making $400 an hour as a computer programmer, then obviously raising the minimum wage up to $7.25 is not binding on you in that particular case, but it will be binding on a worker making only $6 an hour. Okay, so the minimum wage laws, these do not affect highly skilled workers. They do affect unskilled and teen workers. And the consensus in the literature suggests that a 10% increase in the minimum wage tends to raise teen unemployment by about 2%, somewhere in between 1 and 3%, depending on exactly which study you are consulting. And now what we would like to do is consider both the equity and efficiency implications of this minimum wage to think about how politically motivated a buyer or a seller might be in terms of where they want to throw their lobbying weight. So we're going to start off by looking at the pieces of each agent's economic pie without the binding restriction in place, and then we'll consider what do the distributional effects look like when we have the binding price floor in place. So note that if there is no binding restriction, we're going to just go ahead and ignore that blue price floor. The market reaches equilibrium, and in equilibrium, the consumer surplus here is ABC. Similarly, in the market equilibrium, the producer surplus is that bottom triangle that we identified before, which is D and E. So consumer surplus in equilibrium, producer surplus in equilibrium, we're capturing the maximized economic pie here. Okay, however, under the binding price floor, okay, so now if that blue P bar is in effect, the consumer surplus, which again is the area between the demand curve and the price, now that blue line is reduced to area A. Okay, so the consumers, note before, we're getting A, B, and C. Now they only capture A, implying that the consumer's piece of economic pie has absolutely diminished in size. They have a reduced welfare state, a reduction in the consumer surplus. The producers, on the other hand, their surplus is identified by the area below that price floor, above the supply curve to the left of the quantity traded Q bar here. Okay, and that is areas B and D. Okay, so notice the producers, they gave up E, they lost E, which they had in the market equilibrium, but now they've captured B, and it looks like in this picture, if it's drawn to scale, that the producers actually come out ahead here with a bigger chunk of economic pie than they did in the market equilibrium, which kind of makes sense intuitively. We held the price artificially higher, so the sellers are a little bit better off, the buyers are a little bit worse off. You'll notice, though, that if we account for the total economic pie under the bonding restraint, okay, we're actually missing two pieces. The consumers got A, the producers got B and D, but nobody is collecting C or E. So the area CE represents the deadweight loss, and the source of the deadweight loss under this binding price floor was very similar to the source of the deadweight loss that we saw in class under the binding price ceiling. And that source was we blocked some mutually beneficial trades. Okay? In this case of the binding price floor, who was really blocking the trades? Well, it was the buyers of the labor that were not thrilled at the higher price. They defined that Q bar. The suppliers wanted to supply a whole lot, but the buyers of labor, they were really the ones causing a reduction in trade here because the law of demand says at that higher price, they're not going to buy as much. Conversely, under the price ceiling, it was actually the sellers who were the ones that were constraining the volume of trade. Under the price ceiling, the price was capped, and because the price was artificially low, sellers were not as thrilled to produce and sell that product at a lower price under the regulation. All right, so so that pretty much wraps it up for thinking about the both the equity and efficiency implications of price controls. We looked at price ceilings in class. We just went through an example of looking at the minimum wage as an example of a price floor. Both of those price restrictions, both of those forms of government intervention led to deadweight loss because they prevented mutually beneficial trades in these respective markets. Again, this is all provided that the market we are discussing is described by perfect competition, meaning we're in the supply and demand framework. So it looks like that the best the government can do at this point in terms of imposing price floors or price ceilings is to really not do anything. They can impose them in a way it's non-binding. If it's non-binding, then the surplus is maximized. But if they imposed a price restriction in any way that causes Q to deviate from Q star, then there's going to be some deadweight loss generated here. So again, the key idea in thinking about the size of the economic pie was understanding how the price restriction drove the quantity of trade. If Q gets driven away from Q star, either below or above, below blocking mutually beneficial trades, above fostering trades that were surplus reducing. Both of those things cause the total surplus pie to shrink. So as long as Q deviates from Q star, you can be fairly certain that we have some inefficiency, some deadweight loss. Okay, so to wrap up, I wanted to jump back and talk about this idea of price elasticity of demand, which was really a measure of how sensitive buyers are in terms of how they respond to changes in prices. So the way we're going to measure the price elasticity of demand is measuring the percentage change in the quantity demanded, the percentage change in the volume of trade that results from a percentage change in the price of a good. So again, loosely speaking here, this is a measure of how price sensitive buyers are in a particular market. We saw in class that elasticity is very intimately related to the shape of a curve, whether or not we're talking about the elasticity of demand, where we have a negative relationship between P and Q, or the elasticity of supply, where we have a positive relationship between P and Q. We showed in class that the way we can compute the elasticity of demand is actually inversely related to the slope of the curve, and that we could take the price along the demand curve divided by the quantity at a given point, and then divide that by the slope of the demand curve. And I'll post another video that kind of goes through that derivation again in case you were not there for it in class. But the point being is that the elasticity of demand is not directly related to the slope, it's inversely related to the slope. Okay? And what this generally implies is that as the demand curve, or even if it's the supply curve, either way, as the curve becomes flatter, the responsiveness or the price sensitivity tends to go up. The flatter the curve, the higher the magnitude of the elasticity value. Okay, on the other hand, if the curve is steeper, okay, the steeper the curve, the less price responsiveness we're getting from the agent, whether or not it's a buyer or a seller, if it's demand curve or supply curve, this still holds. Okay, the steeper the curve, the smaller the magnitude of the elasticity. Now, one point I mentioned in class is that when we use this formula to compute elasticity, the sign of the slope is actually important. Okay, in the upcoming slides, I'm going to just look at the magnitude of this value, remembering that we're dealing with demand curves which slope downwards. So if you see an elasticity of demand, it technically should have a negative value. More often than not, though, textbooks, as does yours, will report the absolute value of this number or the magnitude of this number, and I will do so similarly in the following slides. Okay, so we're going to think about a variety of demand curves in terms of how their shape implies a particular elasticity value. So the first case that I would like to think about is kind of an extreme situation where we have a vertical demand curve and our buyers exhibit absolutely no price sensitivity. So in this example, we drop the price, but the quantity demanded doesn't change at all, implying that we have an elasticity value literally of 0 here. We change the price, consumers bought the same quantity of goods and services. Okay, a case that's a little bit less extreme. Here's a demand curve that's pretty steep, but it's not vertical, okay, implying that when we change the price, we do get some change in the quantity demanded. In this case, the quantity demanded changed, but not as much in percentage terms as the price had, implying that we are dealing still with an inelastic demand. It wasn't perfectly inelastic like the last case where it was vertical, but we're not getting as much sensitivity, as much fluctuation in the quantity sold as we had generated in the price that caused the quantity to change. Okay, a more intermediate case here will be a situation where maybe the price change and the quantity change are offsetting. This is a special case we refer to as unit elasticity. And as I mentioned in class, being able to identify the situation is important because the unit elastic point in the demand curve turns out to be the one where you're actually maximizing sales revenue if you're charging that magic price that puts you right at the point of unit elasticity. Okay, this demand curve, as we've drawn it in this picture, notice it's not a straight line, it's kind of curvy. And I mentioned in class it's possible if the demand curve is curvy that the elasticity maybe doesn't change across two different points. So it's possible that the elasticity doesn't, but as we're going to see in a moment for a straight line demand curve, the elasticity is different at any 2 points. Okay, if we flatten out the demand curve even more, it's possible that now, after changing the price just a little bit, we get an even larger response in terms of the percentage change in sales. And in this particular situation, we would be facing an elastic demand curve in that the magnitude, the absolute value of the elasticity is bigger than 1. Remember, all these values I'm now thinking about in terms of their magnitudes, not their signs. Technically, the price elasticity should be negative, but in this case, the magnitude would be, the absolute value of it would be bigger than 1. Meaning, if we were dealing with a negative value, it would be somewhere in between -1 and negative infinity. The magnitude of it is larger than 1 in absolute value. The other extreme end of the spectrum could be we're dealing with a flat demand curve, in which case the price stays constant for any fluctuation in the quantity of sales. So this is like the super extreme case of a highly sensitive buyer, where if you drop the price below that, the buyer wants to buy an infinite amount of the good. But if you raise the price above this level, then the buyer doesn't buy anything. They are extremely, extremely hypersensitive to any changes in prices. And so this would correspond to an infinitely elastic demand curve. Okay, so the first thing to kind of keep in mind is that the elasticity is absolutely related to the shape of a demand curve. So when the elasticity goes up, okay, we have a more elastic response. The demand curve or the supply curve tends to be flatter. When the elasticity goes down, we have less price sensitivity, then the curve winds up being steeper. However, along any given curve, okay, as long as it's downward sloping, it's not flat or vertical. If it's downward sloping to any degree, or even upward sloping, I'm sorry, not upward sloping, so we're just thinking about demand curves here. But if it's downward sloping and it's linear, okay, it's a straight line, then the elasticity actually changes at any point along the demand curve. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, this demand curve that we're looking at has a slope of -1/2. The rise is 30, the run is 60, so I do 30 over 60 is 1/2, and it's downward sloping, so it's negative. Okay, so notice the slope of that demand curve is constant. So I plug in that constant -1/2 in the bottom. But as I move along the demand curve, the ratio of P to Q, which is measured up in the numerator of our calculation for the elasticity of demand, that actually changes as we move from point to point. Because of that, the value of elasticity along a linear demand curve is not constant despite the fact that its slope is. Okay, so at the top of the demand curve, we set up here charging a price of 30. I'm selling nothing. So if I was to drop the price just a tiny bit near the top of the demand curve, I go from selling nothing to selling something. And going from 0 to something is an infinite percentage change in my unit sales, implying the top of the demand curve is the infinite elastic point on that demand curve. As we move down the demand curve, okay, my consumers become less price sensitive. And if you consider the very bottom point of the demand curve, I'd be plugging in a price of 0 here, which causes that elasticity value to converge to 0. But intuitively, if I'm near the bottom of the demand curve, if I'm giving the good away for free, people are trying to buy an infinite amount anyway. If I was to drop the price anymore, they still would buy an infinite amount, implying that their quantity demanded did not change at the very bottom of the demand curve. Okay, the very midpoint of the demand curve corresponds to this unit elastic allocation. Again, I mentioned in class that that's a very nice allocation to consider if you're trying to solve the problem of maximizing your sales revenue. So it looks like in this example, if we charged a price of $15 and wound up selling exactly 30 units, then the value of the elasticity of demand, if we plug that into this expression, would be exactly -1. Okay, and what that means is that we're dealing with unit elasticity. Okay, the percentage change in the price is exactly offset by the percentage change in the quantity, implying my total revenue does not change. Okay, so if you were to draw that revenue box corresponding to that price of $15 and selling 30 units at that unit elastic point, that is the largest way you could possibly draw that revenue box underneath that demand curve. One thing we didn't really get into in class was thinking about the determinants of price elasticity, which I'm sure you've seen in the readings as you've gone through. But I wanted to just go through a few examples to wrap things up more or less in thinking about the determinants of price elasticity. And in doing so, we're going to think about examples that kind of compare two common goods. In each example, we're going to think about the price of both goods going up. And then we're going to think about which of the two goods would have the largest drop-off in terms of the quantity demanded. And each of these examples going to teach sort of a general lesson about the determinants of price elasticity of demand, about the various factors of the economic environment that would influence the shape of a demand curve. However, I'm going to suggest right off the bat that all of these examples, maybe except for the last one, are all critically related to the availability of substitutable goods. Okay, and let's just start off with example one. Example one, we're thinking about breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. Okay, price of both goods goes up by 20%. For which good would quantity drop the most in percentage terms and why? Well, the argument here is that breakfast cereal has a ton of close substitutes. Okay, what else could you do for breakfast? You can have bacon and eggs, bagels, fruit, many other substitutes for breakfast cereal, implying that when the price of breakfast cereal goes up, people don't stress about it. They just switch to something else. They switch to another available substitute. So we expect breakfast cereal to be relatively elastic. Consumers would be pretty price sensitive there. Sunscreen, on the other hand, doesn't really have very many close substitutes. If you want to protect yourself from the sun and you don't have sunscreen, your options are extremely limited. Maybe you could buy an umbrella. Maybe you could buy some heavier clothes or not go out in the sun. But point being, when the price of sunscreen goes up by 20%, the demand for sunscreen does not change very much at all because there are no close substitutes. So the lesson from example 1, I'm going to suggest is the general lesson that I want you to accept here. And think about this as we go through examples 2, 3, and 4. But the price elasticity is relatively higher when there are more close substitutes available. Conversely, price elasticity is going to be lower when there are fewer close substitutes available. Now, the next example we're going to go through is absolutely relevant to the availability of close substitutes, but we're going to frame it in a slightly different way. Okay, so in example 2, we're going to consider the good of blue jeans versus the good of clothing. And you're like, oh, aren't blue jeans a subset of clothing? The answer is absolutely. One of these goods is very broadly defined and the other is very narrowly defined. And you'll notice if a good is narrowly defined, then that leaves a lot of options for other substitutes. So when the price of jeans goes up, okay, then what do people do? Well, there are substitutes available. Okay, so we expect jeans to be a fairly elastic good in comparison to all clothing because people have plenty of other options for substitute. You could wear shorts, khakis, corduroys, say Speedos here, probably not a good idea if you want to go anywhere in public. On the other hand, if there are fewer available substitutes because we have really broadly defined the good, and for example, like clothes in general, there's not really many other substitutes. You could walk around without clothes. That's pretty much your other option. If the price of clothes goes up, not a lot of substitutes due to the fact that that good has been defined very broadly. So the general lesson here, again, still related to the availability of substitutes, but the idea is that the price elasticity is higher for narrowly defined goods than broadly defined ones because the more narrowly we define the good, the more available substitutes we leave as an option based on that good's definition. Third example, insulin versus Caribbean cruises. Okay, both of these goods prices go up by 20%. For which one does the quantity drop the most? Well, hopefully you're thinking insulin is absolutely a necessity. If you're a diabetic, there are not really any substitutes for insulin in terms of treating your diabetes. Now, I'm not that kind of doctor, so don't quote me on that. Maybe there are some advances in medicine that I'm not aware of. But in general, diabetic medication, specifically insulin, is an extremely inelastic good because it is a necessity. Why is it a necessity? Well, its relationship to necessity is very close to its relationship of not having very many close substitutes. Why do I need insulin? Well, I wouldn't need it if there were other things that could do the same thing. So insulin is a necessity in some sense because there do not exist a variety of close substitutes. A cruise, on the other hand, is a luxury. It's how you spend your leisure time. How many other substitutes are there for spending your leisure time? There are lots of them. Okay? So this example here is really highlighting this contrast between a necessity and a luxury. And price elasticities tend to be higher for luxuries. Consumers tend to be more sensitive with luxury goods than they are for necessities. Again, this is still fundamentally related to the number of available substitutes. Example 4 gets into something interesting, which has to do with time horizons. And we're going to think about the price of gasoline rising 20%. And the question is, does the quantity demanded exhibit more sensitivity in the short run or in the long run? And we're going to think about why. So if prices went up by 25% or by 20% tomorrow, there's not much people can really do. And you could decide maybe I'll take my bike to school or I'll try to ride the bus or carpool. But in the short run, like in one day, if prices went up a whole lot, I would doubt that everyone all of a sudden stops driving to work. However, in the long run, over a much longer time horizon, if prices went up 20% over like a year or 2-year interval, then people have a lot more time to adjust their decision-making process and their planning. Okay, meaning over a day, well, I might not buy a hybrid car. I might just do something like ride my bike to work. But dealing with high gas prices over years, I may in fact decide to switch and do something like buy an electric vehicle or buy smaller cars or drastically change my gas consumption. Okay, so the lesson here is that price elasticity tends to be higher in the long run than in the short run. Because in the short run, I don't have as much time to adjust, so I'm at the mercy of the current economic environment. Okay, just an FYI, I'm not going to discuss the elasticity of supply too much in this particular video. Reason being is this example also pretty much explains supply elasticity. Okay, if I have more time to adjust my supply, okay, I can be more flexible, I can be more sensitive. But if I have less time to adjust my supply, then my supply curve is going to be more inelastic, a little bit more vertical. The final factor that I wanted to discuss in relationship to determinants of elasticity of demand is the fraction of your income share, the fraction of your budget share. Okay, and the idea here is that if I spend a large amount of money on something, then the price of that thing affects me much more intimately than the price changing of a good that I do not buy at all. Okay, for example, individuals that spend a large fraction of income on rent are absolutely more sensitive to the fluctuation in rental prices than somebody who, for example, owns their home. And on the other hand, an individual who doesn't spend any of their money on cigarettes, okay, would not exhibit any elasticity to a change in the price of cigarettes. I don't smoke cigarettes, so if the price of cigarettes goes down by 20%, my demand is still zero. My demand is inelastic. Okay, so the general lesson here from example 5 is that the price elasticity tends to be higher when you're dealing with a good that takes up a larger share of the consumer's budget. So to wrap things up, okay, the price elasticity of demand. Okay, what is determining the slope or the shape of that demand curve? This, keep in mind, these are not things that shift the demand curve, which you should have read about, and we're going to come back to when we think about predicting market dynamics. But now we're just talking about specifically what determines the shape of the demand curve. And the price elasticity absolutely is a key determinant in relation to the demand curve's slope. Okay, so the first key determinant was the extent to which close substitutes are available. The more substitutes that are available, the more elastic that market is going to be with respect to demand behavior. Okay, whether or not the good is a necessity or a luxury. Okay, necessities had a few close substitutes. We needed them. We did not exhibit a lot of elasticity there, but a luxury good, consumers are extremely price sensitive over. Okay, whether or not the good is broadly or narrowly defined. Are we dealing with blue jeans that have lots of substitutes? Or are we talking about clothing, which doesn't leave open the option of any available substitutes? Okay, time horizons. Individuals can be more responsive in the long run. They're going to be more price sensitive in the long run than the short run. And last but not least, the share of the individual's budget. Okay, the more I'm spending on something, absolutely, the more sensitive I am to changes in the budget share. Okay, so this more or less wraps up our review of the in-class material from Saturday. Hope you enjoyed. I will post the recording of this video soon if you need another look, and I will hang out a little longer in case anybody has any questions. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.